people would like you to believe. There is some evidence to suggest that you can even gain bending through spiritual enlightenment, and I implore you to not neglect your spiritual studies. Du, otherwise known as the Gravedigger of Zulu Pass, buried 5,000 non-bender prisoners of war after forcing them to dig their own graves. If you turn to page 4.
Welcome back to my channel, guys. I hope everyone's having a blessed day. I got a different kind of video for you today, and that is from Avatar: The Last Airbender. I hope you enjoy. So let's get straight into it. So this video is, did benders oppress non-benders? The world building of Avatar.
Quiet, class, quiet, please. If I see any firebending today, you will be removed. We are not having a repeat of last year. Welcome to the Fire Republic Academy and this semester's class on bending history. You may call me Professor Wang Fire. You may not call me Wang or Mr. Flamio. Now, raise your hand if you are a bender. Look around you. The vast majority of your classmates are non-benders, people who, through no fault of their own, were not lucky enough to be born with the power many of you possess. That fact alone has changed this world in ways we often don't like to admit. Bloodshed, revolutions, ugly truths about our world you might want to ignore, but we are here to understand them, aren't we? So please turn to chapter 69 of your textbooks, A Sociological History of Bending by Hideaki Anno. But sir, that's boring. Can't we talk about fun things like, listen here, you little... History is only as boring as the person learning about it. Anyways, it is no coincidence that every Fire Lord up to the last prior to the Republic was an immensely powerful firebender. In fact, we have good reason to believe that Fire Lord Sozin and the royal family more broadly long engaged in a kind of eugenics, marrying only within a select few Fire Nation families to ensure their powerful bending genetics remained within the family. Somewhat hilariously, this has led some people to suspect that there were significant genetic deformities, possibly explaining the trend of mental breakdowns and madness accounted for the likes of Azula and even Ozai himself, prone to delusions of grandeur.
True.
And going even further back, it was the powerful firebending sages who first united the Fire Islands in the earliest eras of our history. And we are not alone, I should mention. The Earth Kingdom, as it was known at the time, has changed hands over the millennia, mostly between powerful earthbending factions. But what about the Earth King and Ba Sing Se? A lot of them weren't benders. Correct, which is why I said factions. While the Earth King was often a non-bender, they were surrounded by powerful, usually earthbending officials such as the Dai Li, whose control over the government was largely owed to their earthbending prowess. In fact, because only roughly 25% of the Earthen Kingdom population were ever born benders in the first place, this meant that disparity between these two classes was even greater than, say, here in our Republic. Compare that to our nation, where as many as 40% of people are born benders today. Regardless, that smaller percentage of the population has always maintained far more power and influence, and it has always been much more difficult for the non-bending masses to resist. Over and over, our history is full of stories that place benders at the center of power, wealth, and influence. Our societies were built with hierarchies and structures designed to keep them there and justify their position. Perhaps the darkest reminder...
I would really love somebody to do a video of potentially a breakdown of why or what determines who becomes a bender and the actual proportions for it. Because canonically, as we know, 100% of air nomads are born as airbenders. And this is the first time I'm learning about, what was it, 25% for earthbenders and 40% for firebenders. I wonder really what determines this, but just food for thought, I suppose.
Reminder of this reality came in 304 BG, when an Earth sage, Jianzhu, otherwise known as the Gravedigger of Zulu Pass, buried 5,000 non-bender prisoners of war after forcing them to dig their own graves. If you turn to page 420 in your textbook, you'll actually find a quote from the Gravedigger in the memoirs of Avatar Kyoshi. He said, "First, I made an example out of the few earthbenders amongst the Yellownecks. I took my time with them. Then, I told the rest that whoever dug the deepest trench to hide in by sundown would be spared, free to return to their homes. Only the ones who lagged behind would be killed. You should have seen it. They dug as fast as their wretched hands could take them. Some of them killed each other over a shovel. They jumped into their holes and looked up with smug little smiles, thinking they'd be the ones surviving, not their compatriots. And there you have it. 5,000 fresh graves dug by their own occupants. I simply swept the earth over the top. Like I once explained to a former pupil, strength is bending people to your will, not the elements." The irony of the Gravedigger's last words there should not be lost on you. While he undoubtedly manipulated them, it is manipulation whilst holding an earthbent boulder over...
That's true insanity. Just like imagine digging your own grave. That must be one of the most psychologically insane things somebody can do to a character. Like, the one time I ever saw this kind of thing happen was a scene in Money Heist. Was that Money Heist? Yeah, Money Heist, the Spanish one. So insane how a guy casually got people to dig their own graves, yeah. It takes a truly unhinged individual to do such madness, but yeah, quite interesting. Who knew about this before this?
Boulder over their heads. Sometimes, benders are blind to the influence they have just by virtue of being a bender, blind to the threat they pose just by being nearby, the power imbalance which inherently exists between you and a non-bender. even if you are in fact entirely harmless to them, even if you mean them no harm. Over and over, it is benders who were overthrowing other benders who ended up controlling the resources and institutions. While the southern and northern water tribes are a touch more democratic owing to their relatively flat hierarchies with smaller populations, they too tend to see powerful waterbending families rise to positions of influence and prestige. What a coincidence. Now, the real question is, why do you think this is, truly?
Because they're, powerful?
Well, yes, but also
Quite a
no.
simple answer.
These days, we tend to imagine bending as a genetic trait you get from your parents. Voila, power. But there's a whole other side to this, one you might have forgotten: spirituality. The elements are deeply tied to the spirits, to enlightenment, even, as much as I sometimes think students are incapable of it. But the more connected to the spirits you were historically, the stronger your bending often was. Need I remind you of Iroh, the Dragon of the West, one of the greatest firebenders of all time, and
That's
he
why
simply
he's the goat.
stepped into the spirit world when it came to die. Keep in mind, Unalaq was also one of the gravest threats our world had ever faced, and yet he was more spiritual than any of us in this room. In the modern era, in urban centers like this, that side of bending has often been forgotten. But I assure you, out in the rural areas, it is very much still relevant. They live alongside the spirits in ways we often don't. We don't tend to face issues with spirits that often, not like we used to in the past, not now that we have a clean power grid, unless we accidentally pollute a sacred river, which does happen from time to time. But in the past, civilization needed people who could understand and negotiate with the spirits when we were at their mercy. In fact, this is how the Fire Nation as it was came to be. It was the Fire Sages who first united these islands under one banner. It was their spiritual and firebending prowess which helped them deal with the spirits terrorizing the island. Likewise, it was those who learned from the moon and ocean spirits that saw the northern water tribe become so powerful in its heyday. That was before the polar collapse. Spiritual leadership has long been just as important as economic and political leadership.
I would love
and for much of our history, benders have painted themselves as uniquely blessed to deal with them, which is only half true. But that's not the same thing. Anyone can be born with bending. Anyone can rise through the ranks. You are correct. Despite the search for an all-encompassing bending gene, we know there is still some randomness. Anyone can be born with bending, no matter your class, your background, even if both your parents were non-benders, despite what some people would like you to believe. There is some evidence to suggest that you can even gain bending through spiritual enlightenment, and I implore you to not neglect your spiritual studies, though I feel like I am just speaking to a wall. It's part of the reason spiritual studies are mandatory at our college. We have one historical account of Avatar Kyoshi's mother in fact losing her bending abilities after forsaking her spiritual roots as an airbender. Airbending is uniquely
Just a touch on that, that sounds very similar to a scene from Spider-Man 2 if anyone's watched it. During the time when Peter's undergoing like emotional turmoil of who he wants to be, whether he's Spider-Man, whether he's Peter Parker, and is trying to understand who exactly he is. It's during this time that the powers are no longer able to work, almost as if a reflection of the person, mind and soul, that if you don't want to accept the powers or accept who you are, then fine, don't have the benefit of the powers as well. And I love when stories do this. It creates a deeper connection to power and why characters have powers and why others don't, and gives a greater message of it's only through understanding and accepting yourself can you truly be whole and realize and utilize your full power and potential. And I love it. Nice touch by Avatar.
Uniquely sensitive to spirituality, but nonetheless, the reality is this. Being born with bending gives you a far greater degree of social mobility than a non-bender. Even today, even in our enlightened era, the Dai Li would often take orphans off the street with earthbending to train them up. Firebenders could quickly rise through the military ranks during the 100-Year War. And while anyone can be born a bender, it's not clear that that means that wealth and influence will make its way down to the non-bending community they came from. All of this reinforces the reality that wealth and power are easily concentrated in the hands of benders. And yes, before you can say it, I can already hear your objection. Some non-benders have attained great influence. Many of the Earth Kings, Ty Lee, Princess Azula's possible lover. You will know of the Kyoshi Confederation, or Kyoshi Island as it was back then, where the now famous non-bender Kyoshi warriors maintained their independence, and eventually became the bodyguards of the Fire Lord and Earth King themselves. And while they used to rely on martial arts and chi blocking, they are now the highest trained tactical operations team in the world, without a single bender. But these must be viewed as the exceptions which prove the rule. In Sokka, the inventor's personal memoir, we actually read of one account where he felt outclassed by his bending friends, a moment of despair during the 100-Year War which led him to forge the now legendary space sword from the metal ore of a fallen asteroid. Now, whether or not this sword truly existed, or if it's some kind of metaphor, is up for debate. It was conveniently lost during the battle over Wulong Forest.
Did he never go and get
But still, history is full of accounts like Sokka of non-benders who make it in spite of the disadvantages. And this tells us something. When so much of the wealth and power belongs to benders, it means much of our history wasn't just written by the victors, but written by benders. We're inherently reading history through the lens of bending, their struggles, their concerns, their way of thinking. Necessarily, war is far less dangerous for a bender than a non-bender. They don't feel the same intimidation a non-bender might, having to face up against firebenders who might leave them with third-degree burns for the rest of their life. We need to be aware of that bias. So much of history isn't just about understanding what happened and why, it's understanding why the story we know is told the way it is.
True. And just to add, I would like to say a lot of the reasons why we don't see it as deep as viewers is purely because of the animation and the art style. Especially when we see, if you've watched the live action, you can really actually see how dangerous firebending really is and how much it actually harms and damages. Even rock and water bending, albeit maybe not destructive, can leave serious wounds. Just think about it. If someone throws an ice dagger at you, that's impaling you just as bad as if it was a knife. But obviously, because it's a kids show and it's comedic and part of nature, that obviously they don't sustain such damages as visual wounds popping through their body, or they've been impaled or completely crushed. The depiction is a little bit different, but in verse, you can see how deadly these situations are and how much damage the elements are. And when you have it that lens, it really goes to show it really is the weak against the strong, and just by design, the strong will always have one over the top of the other. And a lot of times, privilege is invisible to those who have it. In this case, benders who are strong don't understand the privilege of not knowing how it is to feel weak and inferior to somebody who has bending when you do not. I actually love this, and this is actually the first time I'm personally ever even considering this as well. Because when you're deeper, that is true. For somebody to be an advocate of you, there needs to be a degree of empathy and understanding of their struggles, their pains, and what makes them who they are. The avatar is the perfect bridge, but is supposed to be the bridge between human and spirits. But that's only really half true when it comes to the case of them being human. They're more of a bridge to human benders and spirits. And it's really fair to say they fully understand what it means to live as a non-bender when they have never been a non-bender. With the exception of one, but even then, he's only one who has done so. But very interesting, and I love that note. Really makes you think. How far can empathy really go in such dynamics like these?
And this brings me to the Avatar. Believe it or not, we once let someone just go around beating up heads of state with impunity because they happen to have the biggest stick. I know that might sound heretical and radical to say, but I have tenure. Sue me. But the Avatar's role is interesting in our history. The ultimate mediator, yes, but also the ultimate bender. The vast majority of the time, they were raised themselves by powerful, wealthy organizations, again, mostly comprised of benders, being so fundamental to their powers. They are meant to be the representative of humanity in matters with the spirits, but never once in their million past lives did they know what it was like to be born a non-bender. So I ask you, how can they truly represent humanity? And the funny thing is, we know this was a blind spot for Avatar Korra, of all people. Yes, one of the greatest avatars of all time, but we do have accounts from her early days in her youth during the Equalist uprising, which describe her as outraged by the idea of eradicating bending and not really understanding why people were all that up in arms about benders in the first place. Not until later in life. She apparently lashed out a few times and didn't really listen. But if we are to trust the institution of the Avatar, we have to trust that they understand the struggles of those they make decisions for. But before we get to the Equalists, we have to talk about the 100-Year War, because everything changed
when the Fire Nation attacked.
When our nation waged war on the rest of the world. That tension between benders and non-benders was instead refocused on an enemy, with everyone having their role to play, bender and non-bender alike, on the home front or abroad. But the tensions did not disappear. No, the Industrial Revolution, which saw our nation rise to such prosperity, sparked a chain of events which would change the bending world forever. Steam power meant new technology, it meant trains, it meant airships, weapons, new machinery, which meant non-benders could finally rival benders for the first time in history. Not only in combat, but in the workforce. Sokka the Inventor actually writes about this transformation extensively. A train could move quicker than an earthbender could move a carriage. An airship could fly where firebenders couldn't.
Welcome.
The machine could work where benders were tired. Equal opportunity, he might have argued. Not only this, but benders, who tended to be more conservative, were slow to adopt newer technologies. But benders were not. They saw this as opportunity, time to get what was theirs, leading to the emergence of a powerful, wealthy, non-bending middle class. People who invested early, like Hiroshi Sato with Future Industries and the automobile boom of the 50s, or Cabbage Corp, which seized on new agricultural innovations. This industrial innovation thrived in our ex-colonies, the region we now know as Republic City, where a cultural melting pot of earth, water, and firebenders and non-benders created a uniquely powerful workforce, where for centuries, benders had dominated these high-skilled labor positions and industries.
Really,
when benders and equalization with non-benders, machinery was suddenly out-competing them, and benders could go toe-to-toe. And non-benders, seeing this, leveraged their newfound economic mobility for political influence in this volatile, fast-evolving nation, which hadn't quite yet figured out its identity.
There's more than
Similarly,
one way
as
to
horrific
fight.
as the Southern Water Tribe genocide was, the lack of benders for a good half-century meant that society rebuilt itself entirely.
Yes, I'm here.
around a world of non-benders. And you might think, fantastic, story over, and all the nations lived happily ever after. But no, after the war ended, those tensions between benders and non-benders finally started to boil over. Benders were losing their jobs, and where they kept them, wages were going down. Ironically, to the same rate that they had been paying non-benders for some time, all within the space of a couple of decades and in the immediate aftermath of a century-long conflict which had left the world impoverished and in economic ruin. Worse, the industrial rise saw the erosion of many older ways of life, traditional ways of life. Katara the Healer actually spoke of the grief she felt in seeing her old home overtaken by all this new machinery and seeing an oil rig being set up just outside her village. Suddenly machines were doing things that traditionally waterbenders would have done for the tribe. But these older ways of life were, of course, traditions which, though she may not have seen it that way, kept benders in positions of influence and power. And so this wasn't just about economic instability, but in the mind of benders, cultural erosion. Even today, automation at the hands of AGI and things like Hanasu GPT continue to be a concern for many. All of this led to, unfortunately, a bender supremacist movement emerging around 102 AG, led by a woman we now only know as Liling. You'll see in chapter 11 of your textbooks a quote from her. There is a natural order to the world. Benders are leaders. We rule governments. We guide communities. We defend our families. Our abilities make us stronger. They make us greater. We are worth more than non-benders. We will not stand by while they deny us our rightful place in the world. You will see that, sadly, to some extent, these sentiments remain in the darkest corners of our society. The idea that being born with bending means you are chosen by the spirits for leadership. It is a holdover from that time where leaders were also expected to be spiritual negotiators and warriors. We have developed past that, but the ideology is deeply rooted in some communities. All of this led to violent clashes in the streets, walkouts over non-bender-owned factories, industrial sabotage, and, yes, police crackdowns on non-benders. At the same time, non-benders attempted to enact bans on bending in public areas. They repressed certain groups, and extremists capitalized on this economic instability to push their own agenda. Interestingly, this is where the rise in teaching non-benders chi blocking came from. While the technique had been around for centuries, and is these days taught as common self-defense, it was much rarer back then. While the bender supremacist movement was put down with the help of Avatar Aang, the whole fiasco sowed the seeds for a far more important movement in our history. Can anyone tell me who the Equalists were? A radical group of extremists who only desired power and no positive change for the world? That's what my dad says.
History will say.
No, you may recognize this mask. Now, these days, it's mostly a generic symbol of resistance, but it did once belong to the leader of the Equalists, Aman. The risk of persecution galvanized a section of the non-bending population, and technology meant they finally had the tools to take matters into their own hands. The movement evolved over the years, beginning as a relatively non-violent organization, but as income inequality grew in Republic City, their demands and methods grew more extreme. Republic City at the time was governed by a council, and while it had been initially led by Sokka the Inventor, a non-bender, it gradually became dominated by benders once more. We see that regression back to a bending institution. Non-benders, quite rightfully, felt their voices were being ignored. And here I should note that your assignment will be on the following question. Is it more important to represent the different bending cultures in government, or the social and cultural divide between benders and non-benders? Which of these are more vulnerable to the tyranny of the majority, I wonder? Amon's Equalists came to believe that no institutional change was possible, and even if it was, then whatever they could achieve wouldn't ever truly protect them, that the only way to truly protect themselves was to remove bending entirely. Exactly how Amon could remove bending is a matter of debate, even today, but there is no doubt he was capable of it. An ability we've never seen replicated since, I will note. The vision for him was a glorious global revolution which would spread from Republic City. Obviously, with half of you benders sitting here, it didn't work, did it? And though the uprising failed and the Equalists splintered into minor factions pettily squabbling over whatever they were meant to do next, their ideas did not die. The uprising at least brought the concerns of non-benders into the light and forced other nations, including ours, to take them more seriously. Some responded with crackdowns, some with new legislation, but over time, institutions changed. Republic City switched to a presidential system. The shift away from monarchies and towards republics and democracy was definitely connected to the shift away from institutions which protected bender power, a movement we're still seeing today. At the same time, we've developed new efforts to protect our cultural practices, to preserve them for the generations to come, because they do matter. We cannot forget our spiritual roots, and bending is necessarily caught up in that. Traditional ways of roasting honey flakes, of charring wood, of building homes. We continue to hold celebrations that keep those alive, and it's up to all of us to keep them alive, just as we make new traditions. It would be wrong to say that these biases do not exist today. They are undoubtedly still relevant. Benders still get more opportunities in some areas. Spiritual matters still mostly fall to them. But in a world as advanced as ours, there is far more room for the non-bender than there ever has been before. And that is a good thing. All we can do is try to take the next step.
Quite an interesting video. Like I said, I always love how, no matter how many different Avatar videos I can watch, there's always something new I learn every single time. Like, how many of you knew about the whole 25% earthbenders make up the Earth Kingdom, 40% make firebenders make up the Fire Nation? Just little facts like these, albeit not all that important, do add a level of richness and world building, which is just nice to know. Especially that one earthbender who had those guys digging their own grave, like bloody hell. Some of these early Earth Nation stories, they were no joke, and you can really see how, like, Kyoshi is clearly one of the most ruthless avatars, because She's having to put up with nonsense like this. Like, bloody hell. But yeah, the Earth Kingdom were on timing in the earlier periods of civilization. But that's the video for today. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Slightly different. If you'd like more YouTube content, if you'd like more Avatar content, do let me know down in the comments below. And for now, that's everything. Like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, ciao.